Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 10 of this course about living a heathen life. So today we're going to talk through more of the how to adopt heathenry into your lifestyle. So not just a religious practice, but other aspects of life like rites of passage, ethics, and we're also going to cover how to brew mead. So you've got an offering that you can use when you're doing your rituals. Okay, so here we go. What we're going to cover in this module. So first, we're going to just cover quickly the religious bit. This is about prayers and offerings. Okay, then, as I said, we're going to go over rites of passage. So we're going to go over birth, coming of age, marriage, and death, and we're going to look at what did they do historically, and then how you can apply that maybe in a modern day. Maybe you've got a new baby on the way, or maybe you have a wedding coming up, or maybe you're thinking about your funeral or anything like that. Okay, then we're going to go into some detail about ethics, and this would include things about environmentalism. Then we're going to look at nature connection, briefly cover some hobbies, talk about something called hygge, and find a community. So these are all things about how you're going to live your life as a heathen and how you can bring it out of just a ritual practice or a few prayers said each day and actually into the rest of your life. Okay, and then we're going to, as I said, talk about brewing mead as well. And these are just suggestions. Okay, they are not things that you must do. They are not compulsory. They are just ideas for you to pick and choose and use the way you feel is right in your life. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the religious bit. So, as I've said, we've covered this a lot in previous modules. Okay, the most of the modules up till now have been about how you're going to adopt this in your in a religious way. Okay, in your spiritual life. Okay, this is about your prayers and your offerings and things like that. And I would hope by now that you are making regular prayers and offerings at your altar to the ancestors, to the house spirit, to the land spirits, to the Alpha or Alpha, to the Modru or Disir, and to the gods. Okay, certainly I would expect you to be doing this on your holy days and on your first crescent moons, and maybe on Thursdays as well. One thing you could consider in order to sort of expand what you're doing is asking your other family members to join you in your rituals, if they're open to it, if they find heathenry to be something that appeals to them, or you want to have a sort of a more family focused heathenry, maybe see if family members want to join you. Maybe give each family member a job to do within that ritual. That's certainly a good way of sort of getting kids involved in things. And the other thing is to find a local heathen group. Now, we're going to talk about find a community a bit later, but find a local heathen group to try and do ritual celebrations with. Okay, that's a great way for you to connect with other heathens, to make new friends, and to learn about the faith and how to practice. Okay, and you'll come across lots of people's other ideas, things that will contradict what I've been saying throughout this course, and that's fine. But you've got a good, strong foundation now. Okay, and that will enable you to realize what is and isn't based on the sources, what's people's UPG, what's new. Maybe something new works really well and you want to add that in. So find local other heathens, connect with them, and maybe adopt some of what they have, okay, what they've done, what they know works in a modern world, in a modern way. Okay, so that's the sort of the religious bit, which hopefully is already a strong foundation in your life now. So let's start looking at rites of passage. Okay, now we're going to go through quite a lot of stuff here, a lot of information about the four major ones. These are not the only rites of passage that can be had, but the four major ones are birth, coming of age, marriage, and death. Okay, so a rite of passage is an official ceremony or an informal activity that marks an important stage or occasion in a person's life. That's a definition according to the Cambridge Dictionary. And they establish a person's place in the community. Okay. Up until that point, the person may not be considered part of the community. Okay, especially when it comes to sort of birth and to some extent coming of age ceremonies, or initiation ceremonies, in fact. So it gives them a membership of it, or it changes their status within a community. So, for instance, in a marriage, you'll go from being obviously a single person to a married couple, or if you are a teenager coming of age, then you go from being a child to being considered an adult in the eyes of that community. Okay. And they're usually celebrations. Okay. They mark times of transition in our lives. And they're also about transformation. So humans seem to have this need for a way to facilitate transformation, okay, to acknowledge to ourselves and to community that we've moved from one state being to another, okay. It changes how we see ourselves, it changes how others see us. We can't just say, okay, I'm married now, okay, because I decided that. Okay, it doesn't. We need something in our lives to celebrate that, to mark that transition, going from one state to the other state. Okay, it's a psychological thing as well as everything else. Okay, as I said, there's examples like birth, coming of age, marriage, death. There's also religious initiations, baptism and things like that in the Christian church, and there's other things that you could do. There isn't really a ceremony for becoming a heathen like you have with conversion things in like Islam and Christianity. Instead, it's more of a thing you would create yourself. Okay, there wasn't really a historical, or at least we don't have records of a historical way in which someone became a heathen. So you might want to take some of these ideas and create your own if you want that. It's up to you. And rites of passage or initiation often involve 3 stages. Okay, there's the separation stage where you sort of leave the community. You have this transition, this sort of ceremony, this special acts that you do, whatever it is going to be. And then you have the reincorporation back into the community. Okay. Often feasts and drinking were a key part of these celebrations. So if you are going to do some sort of rites of passage or initiation ceremonies or anything like that, try to include feasting and drinking. It doesn't need to be alcoholic drinks, but some other type of drink if necessary. But definitely feasting and drinking is part of that. And a lot of the information I'm taking here is from the Our Troth, Volume 3, Heathen Life by Ben Wagner. So I highly recommend you buy that book as well. It goes into a lot more detail than I can in these slides, and a whole load more topics as well that I'm not covering, but it's a really useful book. Okay. So let's start with rites of passage of birth, okay, and early childhood. So there seems to be sort of 4 stages involved in a heathen birth ceremonies. Okay. So they are the rites for the childbirth itself. Then you've got the first few days after the child is born. Then you've got your naming rites, and then you've got special feasting and fete rites. Okay. So childbirth was a very dangerous time. Okay, it's a lot of things can go wrong. It's not like today where you've got cleanliness and you go into hospital and most of the time you're going to survive, whether you're the mother or the child. In those days, there was a lot of children that died young. There was a lot of deaths of parents in childbirth. The mother would often die as well. So it was very dangerous. Okay, and it was seen as a time of risk where the supernatural would also interact and be dangerous as well. So you needed help from magic, you needed help from the gods to get you through it, okay? And we've got many examples of things like charms, of amulets, stuff like silver keys, for instance, prayers and other magic being used in childbirth, in heathenry and across the world, okay? Because it was such an important yet dangerous time. Odrun of Grota 8, Odrun in there, he uses Gauder to help a woman in childbirth. So Gauder is a type of magic where you're chanting spells of magic. So he uses that Gauder to help this woman in childbirth. In Sigdrifamal 10, it says that if you want help in childbirth, you should write these runes on your hands, grasp the woman's wrists, and call on the Disir. So here we can see there's magic being involved, which is the writing of the runes, and there's calling on the Disir. So they're calling on the protective spirits. Okay. Some of these runes perhaps could be Perthro, Lagus, Berkano, Uras. These are all ones that would help with fate and with strength and with birth and that sort of thing. Okay, so those are the type of runes you might want to use. Okay, and Wagner says it was believed that anything tied, locked, or crossed in the room where a woman was giving birth would lock up the womb. So every door and window would be opened, every lock unlatched, and every knot untied. Okay, so that's maybe a sort of superstition thing you could bring in if you were going to be doing childbirth, maybe at home or I don't know how it would work in a hospital necessarily, but it's something to think about. The midwife would usually have a candle burning during the birth, and this is a custom that's found all over Scandinavia. Okay, so lighting candles when a child is being born. What that's for, I'm not sure, but that is a custom that we find, and so that's something you could do. In Denmark, in the 1300s and onward, you would have neighbouring women who would collect gifts of money for her and hold a kvindegilde, a woman's feast for her. Okay, so what you could do again is you could have some sort of special feast, and maybe, well, people giving gifts. That could be sort of the modern equivalent of a baby shower, essentially. But you could have some sort of special feast, either soon after the birth, just before the birth, that sort of thing. So that's the customs and the ideas around childbirth itself. Okay, and then the child is born, and he's not, or he or she is not yet being named, is not yet being welcomed into the community. Okay, so there's a time period, a very dangerous time period in between. Usually it's around 9 days. Okay, as I said, there's a risk of the mother or baby dying from infection, things like that. There's also a risk of the baby being replaced by a changeling. So fairies and elves and stuff would, in some folklore, take the baby away and replace it with a changeling, an elven baby, basically, that was ugly and horrible and sick and all that sort of stuff. The dead themselves could also cause the baby to get sick. Okay, so it's a really dangerous time. And what happened during this period can also affect a child's weird for life. So a lot of good luck customs are happening. For instance, you go upstairs before downstairs, before you go downstairs. So then the child will rise during their life. That sort of thing. Okay, so if the child gets sick, you might pass them through a hole in a stone, a tree, a fence post, or the earth, and leave an offering there. Often this was done through trees. You can see in the picture there a stone hole where you could pass a child through the stone hole to keep them or to heal them, basically. Possibly the idea was that the spirit was causing the sickness. The spirit couldn't get through the hole; it would get trapped in that hole, because it's a circle and it's a sacred shape and things like that, and therefore the baby would then be okay. However, if there was a child that was very sick or disabled, there was a practice of leaving them out to die, which is a horrible thing, and do not do this, obviously. But that was a practice for dealing with community members, the children who were disabled, basically, and sick. However, the risk then, or whether the children is left out or whether they die at home, is that they then become dangerous ghosts. Okay, so they're often thought of as very dangerous. So there's probably practices around keeping them from coming back and causing harm. But also there's a folk belief that Frau Holle, who's a Germanic goddess from Germany, she kept the souls of unbaptized children with her, and then they could be reborn later. So there's a sort of a nicer idea that basically they're going to, they're going to die, but then they're going to be reborn in the future. An important thing to note is that a child was not seen as having full human status during this time. And laws state that a child who dies within 9 days of birth, before it has a name, is considered the same basically as a stillbirth or the child dying in the womb. So they're not considered to be full human born status. They're more like seen as fetuses still at that point. That said, okay, other texts such as Iceland's oldest law code suggest a child can inherit property and cannot be killed once food has touched its lips. Okay, so as long as it's eaten some food, it's now full human status and shouldn't be put out to die or killed or anything like that. Okay, so that's your first few days. So we've looked at childbirth, we've looked at the first few days and how we've got to be very protective of children during that time. Now, then we get on to sort of the community bit, the bit where you're starting to name the baby, okay? And this is called the Ossavatni ceremony, okay? And Wagner says, the gift of a name to a newborn also gives it status as a human being and as a member of the family, okay? And there seem to be 3 stages to this. There was a sprinkling, a naming, and then a giving of a name gift, okay? So, the naming ceremony. The father, or if the father's dead, it's another relative, sprinkles water on the child and gives it a name. Okay, this Ossavatni means basically sprinkling of water. So it's very similar to the Christian baptism, but it's different. It's a different word. There's evidence that this is not just a Christian influenced thing. Okay, in Galen, a 2nd century Roman, says that the Germanic peoples dipped their babies into flowing rivers as soon as they were born. Okay, so that suggests that this was a practice going on before Christianity got in there and started influencing things. And once sprinkled, it was considered murder then to kill the child. Water may have been considered protective, and this might have been why they were doing this, okay, to protect the child. Havemal 158 says, I know a 13th spell. If I must pour water over a young warrior, he will not fail if he goes into battle. Before swords, that man will not sink. Okay, so basically it's saying that water here is being protective. Because it's protective, we could potentially argue that the reason they may have dipped the child in the river or sprinkled water on the child is because it would be protective for them. Now, when it comes to the actual naming, often the child is named after recently deceased relatives, like grandparents. A dying person or an ancestor appearing in a dream may ask for the child to have their name. And this essentially passes on the person's luck to them. It's a way almost of the luck being reincarnated. It ensures obviously that the person's name survives, and it honors their ancestors as well. So it's a way of honoring the dead ancestors by naming the child after that ancestor. And in Norway, it's customary to name the first son and daughter after the paternal grandparents, and the second son and daughter after the maternal grandparents, and then any additional children after other sort of deceased relatives. Okay. And in the sagas, there's a gift called a nafnfester, which means like a name fastening, which is also given to someone, a child or an adult, when they receive a new name. So, for instance, a gold ring was given by Ragnar to his son Sigurd, or Sigmund. Sigurd, sorry. And Sigmund gave his son a sword and a leek in the Volsunga saga. Okay, so when you get a new name in Viking times, it was considered important to also get a gift at the same time. Okay, so this is like a name gift. Okay, so the child will also get a gift when they are given their name. Some practical considerations about doing this. So, when you go to a hospital and you get your child is born, and and then you obviously have the birth certificate to sort out, and you need to give the child a name for legal reasons. Okay, if you're going to do this from a heathen perspective, maybe you don't want to do that before day 9. So maybe what you do is maybe decide on the name, write it down on the legal documents, the birth certificate and everything, but just don't speak out the name or tell other people until you get to that day 9 point. Okay. You could choose a Germanic name or a Germanic name for their middle name. Okay. Or you could name it after family members, specifically maternal and paternal grandparents. Okay. You can also do naming gifts. Okay. And this can include things like a family heirloom. Maybe there's a family heirloom you want. You could do with money, as they did in Orkneys and Shetland. That's what they used to do, but you could, in the modern times, maybe open a savings or investment account as a sort of gift. You could give them their Thor's hammer. Okay, now you're probably going to want one that they'll have for life, so it might be more of an adulty one that you then give them and keep safe until they're able to wear it. You could give them a sword, obviously, again, keep that safe until they're proper age, which Ibn Fadlan talks about being given as a gift, or other useful items for babies, so from other family members and things. Okay, so there's lots of ideas of what you can do as a baby naming gift. Okay, and then of course there's the celebration. So you can make this into a whole big festival type thing, celebration thing, where you do your baby naming with the community, and then you have a feasting period as well as part of it. So often celebrations of the birth included lots of feasting and drinking. In fact, the Danish name for childbirth, barsel, comes from the Old Norse meaning child ale. And in Orkney and Shetland, people toasted the baby's health using the blithegles custom. Okay, so they're toasting the child. So drinking here is a part of this celebration of birth. Now, Snorri says that each person also has these lesser norns. So we talked about these in module 3, about the Disir and the Modru, and we talked about the lesser norns who visit at our births and set our fates. We also have various sources which show children being taken to CRSs to find out their fates, and for certain character traits to be implanted within the child. For instance, in Saxo, in Flatter Yarbuk. So what you could do is sort of reenact this. Okay, so have your feasting and stuff, and then you have 3 women maybe who dress up as fates, and they will speak blessings and hopes over the baby, and call on the gods basically to grant certain character traits to them. Okay, so this is something else you could have as part of your ceremony. So you've got your childbirth sort of superstitions to do. Then you've got the first few days and the protections, and then you've got your baby naming ceremony, which has the sprinkling of the water, the naming of the baby, and the giving of the gift. And then you have a big celebration where you have feasting and drinking, and possibly these women dressed as lesser norns to give character traits, speak blessings, call on the gods, and things like that. Okay, so that's your sort of birth rites of passage. Now, what about coming of age? So coming of age ceremonies, these are ceremonies that normally when you get into adolescence or even into adulthood, okay, there's a coming of age ceremony in a lot of different communities. And these recognize that basically someone has reached adulthood in the eyes of that community. It may not be in the legal community, like a legal status, because you have to be 18 or whatever to do that, but it could be that in the eyes of the particular community that you're part of, that person has reached the adulthood. They're ready for the responsibilities that entails in the eyes of the community. Okay. Now, what age should this be? We have lots of different suggestions from the different lore. Okay, so you're going to have to sort of work it out. Okay. So different laws, texts, and archaeological finds suggest different ages. But on the whole, there's two key times really when there seems to be some sort of transition stage. Around 12 to 15 seem to be people when people can inherit property, be legally accountable for crimes, start using weapons, get married, become judges at the old thing, or wear more elaborate types of jewelry. Okay, so 12 to 15 seems to be some sort of a coming of age stage. And then you've also got a recognition at age 20 of a higher level of coming of age. Okay, so Beowulf suggests that they were seen more then as proven warriors at that point. So they would have been warriors at 12 to 15 onwards, and then around age 20, they then become proven warriors, and they get better weapons and things like that. Okay, and Tacitus himself also says that boys could not bear weapons until the community decided he had proved his worthiness. Okay, so clearly there's some sort of trial they have to undergo to prove that they're worthy to be able to bear weapons in the community. Okay. And Vatnsdæla Saga 2 says, and now you've reached the age where it's time to test yourself and find out what Haminga, which is luck, you'll win. Okay, so again, all these are suggesting that there is probably some kind of rite of passage involved in going from sort of childhood to adulthood in the ancient heathen communities. So the academic Danieli, he looks at the sagas and he says that the Vigaglon saga and Grettis saga, they both suggest a rite of passage for males was the following. Okay. So a boy of noble birth, he leaves his family and he visits the ancestral family home. He stays there for a time where he is ignored or treated with contempt. He is then challenged to a battle and the men take him to the battle place. He fights and is expected to win but not kill. And then the war band accept him and give him a sword as a gift. Okay, so there's lots of things here. He's being taken out of the community, ignored. Then he has to go through this trial, which is a battle, and then he's welcomed back into the community and given a gift. Okay. In the legendary sagas, we have a boy spends time as an outlaw. So again, he's coming out of the community for a period, and then before he comes back in. So Sigmund and Sinfjotli, they spend time in the forest as werewolves, or they're expected to kill a monster. Usually this then involves eating the beast's heart and or drinking its blood to gain its power. Okay, so it might be like a bear or a wolf or something like that. Okay. Now, Ginnup suggests that there's 3 stages to a rite of passage in any culture. As we've already talked about and mentioned, there's the separation, there's the transition, and then there's the reincorporation. Okay, so the youth is separated from society. They then learn some sort of special knowledge, or they undergo testing that changes them. And then they're reintegrated ritually back into society to take up their adult role. So when you're creating your own coming of age ceremonies for teenagers, you should involve all 3 of these elements, basically. And you should do them when the community considers the person mature enough. So rather than worrying about a specific age, when does the person seem to be the right maturity to do these things? You should make sure that the ritual is challenging, so they can prove themselves physically and mentally, and meaningful, okay, but not illegal, degrading, or genuinely dangerous. Okay, we're not talking about hazing here. We're talking about a celebration ritual of their new status in the community. So the separation stage, okay, you're preparing them for the ritual. You teach them some important skills, you talk through what it means to be an adult, and then you take them to this place where they're separate from the community. It could be maybe like taken outdoors or something, like to a forest or something, I don't know. Then you have your transition, which is like the challenges. And ideally, they'll be doing this alone, okay? It could be, for instance, utiseta all night. So they're asked to go out to a grave mound or a forest and just stay there all night. Maybe they're given a question to meditate on an answer, or maybe they're given a wisdom text to learn, like the Heathenry. Maybe they do some bushcraft in the wilderness. Maybe there is some sort of mock fight and defeat of a monster or an ancestor, who then gives them the family heirloom or gift. We know that there is accounts in the lore of heroes needing to go into a burial mound of an ancestor to get that ancestor's sword. So you could do some sort of reenactment of that type of thing. Okay. And then you've got your reintegration. So they're taken back into the community. They must then prove their skills in front of everyone. For instance, if they've produced a craft of some kind, or they do some sort of skill, they've got to prove that they've mastered that skill. And then you just finish with a ceremony to welcome them. Okay, so this could be feasting. This could be a block to the young person's ancestors and gods, and then have some prayers asking them to bless the young person. They may put on special adult clothes or tokens. They may get a new hairstyle. They may get a new name, and if they do, a new name gift, such as a weapon or a Thor's hammer, or maybe items for their own altar so they can do their own blots. Okay, so there's lots of different things you could use to create a ceremony like this for a young person. Okay. Okay, so we've done birth, we've done coming of age. Now let's talk about marriage. Okay. So in heathen times, marriage was often more about pragmatism, economics, or alliances between families, rather than about love. Okay, the love idea of marriage came more in the sort of Victorian times. Before that, it's more economically important, or alliances and things like that. Okay, very often it's arranged by the families themselves. Okay, so rather than it being a two people find each other, it's something that's arranged for them. And usually the woman's consent was sought, and they could easily divorce a husband, for instance, but it was not always sought. Okay, so that's what it was like in the old times. And even if it didn't start with love, we do find phrases like their love began to grow, which happened over time. So people did then come to love each other over time. Even the engagements themselves were long processes, and usually these are processes of negotiation between the families. Okay, because basically the woman leaves the household and they join the male's household. Okay, so the woman's parents are actually, then their household are losing an important and productive member of society, so they have to be compensated in some way. So it's very much an economic transaction. Okay, and they need to define what each family would contribute to the new household as well. Okay, so the woman, so the woman's household has lost a family member; they need to be compensated, and so there's also a new household being created as well. So the mother, so the man's family also needs to contribute as well. So marriage also wasn't just about the bride and groom. Okay, it affects the sort of fates, the luck of the families themselves too. So it's important that they're involved in this case. When was the best time for marriage? Often during the waxing moon. That's mean when the moon is going from new up to full, not the waning moon. Okay, midsummer was often chosen. Now this is more probably in the Christian era rather than the heathen era, because there's obviously, as we said, a lack of evidence about whether midsummer was actually a heathen thing. Folk traditions also suggest May and harvest time are bad times for marriages. Okay, but again, that's later folk traditions. Were there same-sex marriages? Possibly. There's one possible piece of evidence, but we cannot be sure. There's these things called the Goldegubers, which are small sheet gold plaques. Okay, they're like very, very small. They've got usually images of two men, or man and woman, or two women, or things like that. Most of them are just men and women. Okay, a man and a woman. But there's a couple that have them both wearing male clothing, or both wearing female clothing. So it's possible that that is evidence of some kind of same-sex marriage or relationship going on. But it's not, we're not sure, basically. Can you marry a non-heathen? Now, some religions will say that you're not allowed to marry someone outside of that religion. I think within heathenry, especially in the modern times, it's ultimately up to you. But there are important things to think about and work out before you get married, okay? Firstly, how will the other person's family react to your faith, especially if the other person is perhaps, say, coming from a strongly Christian family or something like that? What faith will the children be brought up in? Is your partner comfortable with the ways you want to express your faith at home? For instance, if you're going to set up an altar, is that going to be an issue to them? Is your partner open to participating in some heathen activities that don't compromise their beliefs? Would they accept some heathen customs as part of other celebrations? For instance, Yule things at Christmas. So whether it's Yule decorations or other Yule ceremonies or whatever at Christmas time, will they accept that? So you need to think about that, okay? There's also other things to discuss before marriage: expectations, values, your life and health insurance, retirement plans, household budgets, long-term goals, access to money, provision for any children, gifts from parents, the division of household chores, how children will be looked after if both of you die or get disabled. Okay, so this is just as there was a period of during engagements when there was lots of negotiation between families. This is something, again, you're thinking about planning before you get married. Okay, lots of things to think about there. Now, when we come to marriage itself, gifts were a very important part of marriage. Okay, gift giving was essentially the first act that you do in a marriage relationship. Okay, and each family has to contribute something as part of the marriage. So what would happen is the wife's family would give a dowry, okay, called the Heathenry, okay, and this represented the wife's portion of her father's inheritance. Okay, that was her father's inheritance, her portion of that, and that was the dowry that would be given into the household. The husband family, his family would give the bride price, the munder, and this had to be roughly of equal value. Okay, so then they're both putting stuff into the household. The husband himself also gives his wife a morning gift, a morgengifting, on the morning after their wedding night. Okay, so this isn't prior to the wedding. This is the day after. Okay. And then these gifts were given to help basically with the setting up and running of the household. A bit like people give wedding presents now. But this was a more formal thing from the specific families. Okay. In the King sagas and the legendary sagas, the couple also usually gave gifts to each guest to go home with. Okay, this is called the Leise ut med Gudjoffel, to dismiss with gifts. So again, you can, at the wedding, rather than them giving you gifts, you could give each guest a small gift. Okay. So wedding presents from friends and families at marriages, this is a modern equivalent basically of the dowry and the bride price. So it's a good thing to include within your heathen weddings. Another custom we find is the hallowing of the bride, okay, by placing a Thor's hammer in her lap. If we look at Thrimskvida 30, you've got Thor who goes to basically he's going to trick this giant and think that by thinking he's Freya, this giant called Thrym, okay, and there's a line in there where Thrym says, "Bring in the hammer to hallow the bride, lay mignoner in the maiden's lap, let Var's hands hallow us together." So essentially we think that might have been talking about customs that were actually around in the Viking times. Okay, and so the hammer is placed in Thor's lap. Basically, the hammer has been stolen. So obviously, then he gets hold of the hammer and he can kill the giant and all that sort of stuff, and stop and trying to marry Freya and things. But basically, it gives us a clue of what we can do. So it could be that you bless the marriage with a hammer. Now, it may be that you don't want to have the hammer just in the bride's lap. It could be held above the married couple, and we saw prehistoric Bronze Age stones where it looks like a god with a hammer is blessing, or an axe is blessing this couple that were getting married. So you could do that. Interestingly, it mentions this goddess called Var, who is one of Frigg's maidens, and she's one who hears oaths. So this suggests that she's important to a marriage ceremony as well. And she listens to the oaths that the couple make to each other. Okay. There's also bridal veil mentioned. Okay. Thor, again, is wearing this bridal veil. So he's basically dressed up as Freya getting married. And so folk customs also include the bride wearing a special bridal crown, which symbolizes her virginity. Okay. So you could have some sort of special veil or crown as well for the bride. Okay. Then you've got feasting. Okay, feasting is an important part of any wedding, and most accounts of heathen weddings focus on this. Okay. The Old Norse word for wedding is drekka, to drink the wedding, which suggests that the wedding drink was really important. The wedding was also called the Bridaaloth, the bride ale. Okay, so again, suggestions here of the drinking being a really important part of the wedding. Various sources suggest the betrothal was only made official when the wife brought a cup to the groom to drink, and then he took her hand. So Wagner says here, thus it seems likely that betrothal was often sealed with a drinking ritual in which the woman brought a drink to her future husband, as she would be expected to do at future feasts when they were held as man and wife, and he would take her hand. Okay, so you could introduce that part into a wedding. The couple could also share a cup of wine together. So drinking is an important part of a wedding ceremony, okay, for the heathens. There's also a custom of the wedding guests running from the ceremony site to the feasting hall. Okay, you'd have the bride's family and the groom's family, and they would run from the ceremony site to the feasting hall, and whichever family was last, the losers, they have to serve the drinks to the winners. Okay, so you could include that, and there have been modern heathen weddings where that's happened. They've introduced that. And the central part of any wedding ceremony, of course, is the vows. Okay, so you should obviously make your vows, but make sure that you only make vows that you can keep, and ensure they are written in the right way for this. Okay, so if you're using a traditional wording of vows, you might need to amend them to make sure that they fit what you're happy to actually vow to do. Okay, what you're happy to make an oath on. We're going to talk about oaths a bit later, actually, in the ethics section. But one thing you might want to do is consider holding an oath ring, both of you together, as you say vows. Okay, so oath rings were usually actually quite big, not like the small little rings that we have on our fingers, but they were sort of arm ring sort of size shapes. And you could perhaps both hold those as you're saying vows, something like that. And we'll discuss vows on oaths a bit later. And then the final part of the heathen marriage ceremony is the exchange of swords. Okay, now swords were often family heirlooms and symbols of a family's lineage. Okay, as well as the groom's ability to defend his family. So often they're either presented to the hero by a supernatural being, or the hero must retrieve them himself. So he'll go into an ancestor's grave mound and get the sword that way. We've got an example, for instance, of Hervor, who takes one from her grandfather's mound, sorry. And one is also taken from Olaf Geirstadhalfr's mound. Tacitus also wrote that Germanic husbands and wives exchanged gifts of weapons. Okay, so you could both exchange swords. And medieval Germanic literature has examples of marriage oaths being sworn on swords. Okay, so instead of the oath ring, perhaps you could use a sword to swear your oath on, or you hold a sword in one hand and you hold the oath ring in another, and you do it that way. The Frisians, they had a custom of a husband blocking a bride from entering the home using a marriage sword. So clearly there is some sort of important marriage sword involved. A marriage ceremony, therefore, could include exchanging swords or other heirlooms and making the marriage oaths on them. Okay, so that's something you can consider doing. Keys, again, these symbolize a woman's ownership of the household, because in heathen times, a woman was the head of the household, basically. She organized everything and ran everything, made sure it all worked. She could also play a role, okay? So these keys, sorry, could play a role. So there's an example, for instance, where a farmer marries a woman called Snower, and she is called Hanging Luca, hung with keys. So perhaps the ceremony could include ritually giving your wife a copy of the household keys, or both partners exchanging copies of their keys to show they are sharing resources with each other. Okay, so this is all about the heathen wedding and marriage. Okay, so there's different things you can have. You need to have your gift giving. You need to have your oaths. You maybe have your hammer blessing. Maybe the giving of a drink from the bride to the groom or to each other. An exchange of swords and possibly keys, and also feasting. So those are the key elements to think about when you're putting together a heathen marriage ceremony. Okay, and finally on the rites of passage, let's talk about death. So let's start off with preparations for death. Okay, the lore gives us examples of heroes who face death with courage, and that shows us the right attitude with which we should approach death. It's all about being courageous in the face of it. Okay. But those heroes also sometimes left instructions on their wishes. So it's important for us to do the same, okay? So we should be planning our funerals. We should be leaving written instructions like wills, a power of attorney, wishes for how you want your body disposed of, and ideally payments for funerals too, okay? So those are things to think about, practical things. They did them in the old times, and we should do them now as well. It's also worth having a spiritual testament, okay, which basically shows what to do with your spiritual items, and perhaps a separate executor for that. And something to include there is what you want, any items that you want buried or burned with you as well, okay, can be part of that spiritual testament. Now, if you're with someone who is actually dying during that process, there are some things you can do. You can talk to them about the journey they'll go on and what awaits them. You can consider singing a death song to them, okay? We'll talk about that in a bit as well. You can ask Odin and Hel to help them to their next destination. In England and Scandinavia, there was a custom basically to leave a window or door open, and that allows the dead spirit, once they die, to leave, okay? But it's also thought dangerous, especially if someone was a magic worker or they died from suicide, to take the corpse out through the door, because otherwise they can find their way back in and cause issues for the living. Okay, so the sagas and lots of folk tales basically tell of people making holes in the wall and then taking the body out. So you might want to sort of, if the person dies at home, take them out through the window. Okay. Now, in folklore rites, things are done to keep the corpse from rising. Okay, so they may tie someone's feet together. They may get a dish of salt or scissors and put them on the body, or they might stick needles in the feet. Okay, this is because they were very worried about the dead rising up again as Draugr and coming back and causing problems. Sigurd Driffelmal 33 suggests that the corpse should be washed and combed before burial. Possibly this is so that if the spirit of them is their spirit's still around, they'll be pleased with how their body's being treated, basically. And what you could also do is consider some hell shoes. Okay, these could be put on the corpse's feet to give comfort in their walk to the other world, as we see in Gisli Saga does this. So some special shoes called hell shoes could be given to them. Now, after you prepared them, there's then the idea of a wake and the funeral, okay? So firstly, you start out with a custom of keeping watch over the body at night. So in the ancient times, they didn't take them to a funeral parlor who dealt with all this sort of stuff. They would have the body at home. They would watch over that body at night. Okay, this is something that happens in Saga of Eric the Red and other tales as well. In the Norwegian Gulathing's log 23, it says that funeral feasts were held on the 7th or the 13th morning after death, or sometimes even later than that. And other texts from Germany and Sweden mention the 3rd, the 7th, and 13th. Okay, so those days seem to be important days for when you would hold a funeral. Okay. Svarfdale Saga mentions funeral feast itself lasted 3 nights, as was customary after burial. So you'd watch over the body on the 7th and 13th, or the 13th morning. You have your funeral with funeral feast, and then you basically feast for 3 nights after that burial. So you bury them, have your feast, do it for 3 nights. Some records, such as Tacitus, suggest people were expected to grieve privately in their hearts rather than openly mourning, but the actual practice seems to be different. For instance, Beowulf mentions that people were mourning loudly, basically. So what happens is his men ride in a circle around his burial mound, and they're lamenting and praising his deeds. And so it's very much more a public affair rather than in their hearts. And also riding around in a circle is also found in Greek poetry as well. So we've got similarities there. Okay. A very important part of that funeral, that ceremony bit there, is singing death songs. Okay. So Alfric, a Christian in the 10th century, he writes to priests and he says, "You shall not rejoice for the departed man, nor visit the body unless someone invites you there. When you are invited there, forbid the heathen songs of unlearned men and their loud cackling, nor may you eat nor drink where the corpse lies, lest you imitate the heathenry that they practice." So this is interesting because this tells us the sort of things that were going on in these funerals. Okay, so you've got heathen songs going on. You've got loud cackling, that's maybe laughing, telling stories, that sort of stuff. You've got eating and drinking, okay? So the idea that it might imitate the heathenry that I practice probably suggests that this is toasting to the dead, honouring the dead, maybe with offerings or something. Maybe the songs were praising the dead person. And then Butchert of Worms in the 10th century again, he says, "Hast thou observed funeral wakes, that is, being present at the watch over corpses of the dead, when the bodies of Christians are guarded by a ritual of the pagans? And hast thou sung diabolical songs there, and performed dances which the pagans have invented by the teaching of the devil? And hast thou drunk there, and relaxed thy countenance with laughter?" So again, more examples of what's going on here. So you've got watching over the corpse of the dead, you've got singing songs, performing dances, drinking and relaxing and laughter. Okay, so it's feasts, it's dances, it's songs and singing. These are important parts of the funeral. Okay. Now let's talk more about this singing part of stuff. So the kings, such as the Visigoth king Theodored, were honoured with songs. Okay. Elig Skallagrimsson's Sonatoric, okay, which is a poem that we've got, which laments the death of a loved one. So people would write poems about the loved one. They would write songs about them and sing them. The 8th century Indiculus Superstitionum et Paganiarum forbids singing dadsises, songs over a corpse. So what are these songs? Are they magic songs? Are they laments? Are they songs addressed to the dead themselves? For instance, to help the soul on its way. For instance, you've got wake songs, okay, and these often have travel instructions for the dead. You've got the Lick Wake dirge, which is more of an Irish thing, but in the 1686 it comes from, and it's telling the dead the sort of journey they need to go on to get to heaven. And you can find heathenized versions of this, okay, to tell them how to get to hell. So you could sing these special songs at the funerals to help them, or at least the wake, to help the person on. Or you've got the Norwegian Drunkvede as well. And these often mention going over a bridge, okay? So that should be part of any song that you're singing. Other accounts talk of games being played, stories being told, prayers being said. Alfric, again, he complains that some men also drink to the dead man's corpse all night long. Okay, so you've got songs, but then you've also got these drinking things. Okay, you have these special funeral ales, and after the funeral, a feast was held called the Arvel, the inheritance ale. So this is what, so the funerals happened, and now you're having the inheritance happening. And at this Arvel, guests would toast the dead person and recount their great deeds. Okay, and in England, you've got this Arvel bread, which is normally like cakes or biscuits, which is being made for everybody. And you've got the Norwegian folk custom of a dead person given a verfaskal, a farewell bowl. Okay, so it says a bowl of ale was placed on the coffin between two lit candles, and the contents were poured into smaller cups and handed to those present relatives first. Okay, so we've got these special drinks, whether it's the inheritance ale, you've got these special foods, and you've got this farewell bowl, this velfarskal, okay, which is then sort of shared amongst everyone. So the wake or the Arvel includes watching over the corpse, songs to help the dead on their journey, dancing, rejoicing, feasting, drinking and toasting to the dead all night, recounting the stories and the great deeds of the deceased, and also this drinking with this bowl or this ale. Okay. It can also happen at the graveside, so you could do these things at the graveside as well. And there's lots of evidence archaeologically of people feasting around the gravesites. Okay. Okay. And then you finally come to the burial. So the burial, both burial and cremation are both practiced by heathens. Okay, this is seen both in written sources and in the archaeology. It changes based on the time period you're looking at and the particular culture or group of people you're looking at. So the sagas mention the age of burning and the age of mounds. And it's cremation that seems to have been the older practice. Okay. Now, Inlingo Saga 8 says that Odin, he introduced the custom of cremation. And Snorri says that Freyr instituted mound burial. So it could be that different gods and their followers use different practices. So depending on which gods you are honoring, depends on which way of burial or death, which way of burial or cremation you're going to have. Or maybe it depends on where you wanted to end up. Okay. Now, a funeral pyre was sometimes built directly on the gravesite, and funeral mounds were then raised over the pyre site. Okay, so that's something you could consider if funeral pyres are legal. You can have cremation urns. Okay, there are cremation urns which were used, and often they are decorated with special symbols such as Thor's hammer or runes. You can see in the picture there that there's some runes on that cremation urn. But they'd also have things like the Thor's hammer often as well, or sometimes shapes or animals or wheels and things like that. So Wagner says, it was common in England and Scandinavia to dig a ring-shaped ditch around a cremation grave and use the excavated dirt to build a small mound over the grave. Okay, so you get the grave site, you dig and put your urn in there, and then you dig around the outside of it and make basically a small mound over the grave. Okay. But in even Fadlan, it says, this is a heathen talking to him, we burned them in an instant, so that at once and without delay they enter paradise. So this is very much once the Valhalla idea comes up in heathenry and develops, the idea that the heathens will go to some sort of other afterlife with the gods. this one, they're saying rather than leaving them in the grave mound, they die in an instant, or they're sort of burned up in an instant. Their soul is probably released at that point, so it can go on. Okay, so this suggests basically that if the body was still there, the soul may stay there still. Whereas if you are cremated, then your soul's going to leave immediately, or parts of your soul, depending on, because they believed in many multiple parts of the soul. Parts of the soul can go on immediately. If we look at the Icelandic sagas, though, cremation is usually only done when a corpse has risen and is causing trouble. So if there's a draugr and the corpse is causing trouble, then they'll cremate them. But it was not really used that much in Iceland. Other than that, they tended to focus more on the burial mounds and things. This is probably because there's a lot of wood required, and just Iceland just does not have the trees and did not have the wood to make the cremation mounds, okay, or cremation funeral pyres. Okay, if we look across Scandinavia and England and Iceland, often the dead are buried in mounds. Okay, if you look at this famous Sutton Hoo mounds, there's lots of other ones. There's lots around Uppsala and other places as well, all over the place really. The Goths themselves have two words for grave in their language, and both are related to mound. So again, suggesting that they used burial mounds. Sometimes they have graves which are lined with wooden planks, or even have these big, elaborate wooden chambers, which then allow for these lots of grave goods. And you see that particularly on the Sutton Hoo stuff. Sometimes a coffin is used, but other times they line the graves with stones, or they put stones on top of the bodies they feared, like magic workers and things like that. So you might get a sort of a hole dug into the ground. You get it lined with sort of either wood or stones, and then it's built on top. The mound is built on top. And sometimes they just reuse earlier Bronze Age burial mounds. Okay. Now, both sagas and archaeological remains show that there were ship burials. Okay, and not what we mean here is not that they go out in a ship and she's set on fire and burns and all that. Not that type of burial. What we're talking about is that either stones made in the shape of a ship, or an actual ship is buried on land, okay, in the grave site, and then the mound is put on top. Okay, so you can see this at Sutton Hoo, Vendor, Oseberg, and so on. The only time we actually see this burial in a ship that's then pushed out to sea is mentioned in the legendary sagas. Okay, normally it's on land. Okay, whether that's in the archaeological record and Ibn Fadlan's records. Okay. Okay. So more about burial. Now, they often had grave goods, okay, that were buried with them, and this could be all sorts of things. There was sacrificed animals, there's treasure, there's board games, there's drinking vessels, there's tools of their different professions. So you might have wands or spindles or cooking gear or armor and weapons. Bodies are often dressed up in fine clothing, especially if they were sort of rich, noble people. You also find Thor's hammers, miniature weapons, so very, very small spears and very, very small, like literally like the size of your finger type thing, sort of bow and arrows and things like that. So maybe they have some sort of protective function. They're not the full weapons, but they're sort of examples of weapons which then somehow in the afterlife the person can use. And also amulets were often there as well. Food and drink were also placed in the graves. So got fruit and nuts were common, or animals. Sometimes the grave goods are burned with them. Other times they're added to the ashes at the end. Okay. And it's possible that some grave goods were there as part of elaborate rituals in which the living acted out myths or important events in the dead person's life. Okay, so that's a sort of a quite new theory in archaeology that it's around about, or the the rituals of the funeral were more about myths and important events rather than a specific type of funeral ritual. Okay. Runestones can be set up. Okay. These can be set up for many reasons, including to allow the dead to be remembered. And there's a quote in Heathenry which says, "Memorial stones seldom stand near a road unless kinsman raises them for kinsman." So suggests that it is important to put up for a family to put up memorial stones. Okay. They aren't really grave markers. They're more just set up somewhere to commemorate the dead, probably on their land. Or, for instance, if someone died far away or at sea and their body couldn't be recovered, well, then you might put a memorial stone up to remember them that way, because you're not going to get their body. They often actually contain curses for anyone who disturbs the dead or the monument itself. Okay. Some show images of the dead person's journey. So, for instance, traveling in a ship or a wagon, or it might show scenes of different legends and things like that. If you look at, for instance, the Gotland picture stones, such as the one I've got in the picture there, they memorialize dead men. Okay. And Anders Andren suggests that they seem to be shaped like doors, so may well be symbolic doors to the dead. So maybe they were stood there and then you could go up and put an offering and somehow the dead would receive it through the door. That's a theory or hypothesis. So yes, you've got grave goods, you've got rune stones there, or big memorial stones. So that's the 4 types of main rites of passage. Okay, so we've got birth, we've got coming of age, we've got marriage, and we've got death. Okay, those are the 4 main things. So I hope I've given you quite a lot of ideas there that you can use to maybe plan your own wedding, funeral, create a ceremony for a young person, or to celebrate the birth of the child. I'm going to finish this video here, and in the next video we're going to talk about ethics.